Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my very warm privilege to be introducing David Wade to you tonight on behalf of Herbury Books. We published David's new book, The Story Animal, Reflections on the Narrative, last week, and we're absolutely delighted that it's coming out. And we think that if one word could describe David's book at the moment, it will be a manual for our times, as we live in very unusual times, and we think that the contents of David's book are particularly suitable. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce David Wade to you. David is a historian, an artist, and much of his work focuses on the intersection between mathematical geometry and art, and he's a particular authority on Islamic art and sacred geometry. But he's turned his pen onto something even more defining of humanity at the moment, and possibly defining of humanity always, which is the currency with which the very human race functions, and that's language and stories in particular. His new book, Story Animal, Reflections on the Narrative and its Extraordinary Power to Inform, Persuade and Enchant, is out now, and we're privileged to have David with us. So very warm welcome to you, David.
Thank you.
To start off with, well, we've got some questions to talk about, obviously, but to start off with, humanity defines its very experience and its very existence through stories. Internal narratives help us to understand who and what we are and what we're doing in this world, where we are and how we see the world around us. How do you see the role of the story in understanding our present situation at the moment? We live in times of Brexit, coronavirus, political upheaval. How does the story play into that?
Yes, well, as the Chinese proverb has it, these are interesting times. And as most people know, that's supposed to be a curse. And for someone who's taken an interest in these things, the recent intensification of rumours and conspiracy theories and the emergence of more extreme political views seems to be one of the more defining developments of recent times. These are, of course, all symptomatic of unease, an underlying fear of destabilization, a loss of cultural certainty, a weakening of the cultural narrative, in fact. And this has affected not only the UK and the US, but it's more widely felt in recent times. Here, the vote for Brexit was clearly based on an emotional response. It was a reaction to the fairly substantial cultural changes that the UK has seen over the past decade or couple of decades, rather than any rationally thought out analysis of what might be the most advantageous political future for our country. Similarly, the US seems to be in a crisis of cultural confidence. It's clearly no longer the world leader, either in industry or even in culture. And losing this status, the sense of being top dog, is a painful business. And as ever, in both our countries, there were no lack of opportunistic politicians willing to take advantage of these underlying fears and prejudices for their own narrow political ambitions. But that is very much the way it always has been. We are human. Things happen, circumstances change, and we have to try and make sense of them by creating plausible narratives. That's to say, plausible to ourselves, at least. So we assign causes to perceived threats, and in more negative reactions, we blame other agencies. Coronavirus, that we're in the throes of at the moment, in common with all past pandemics, has complicated these and other issues throughout the world. Social instability and rumour are the inevitable outcome of pandemic disease, and this has also always been the case. It's a deep-lying and understandable reaction. And it is bound to exacerbate existing fears and anxieties here and everywhere, really.
And something that you said just then made me really think, which is that we construct narratives as a way of understanding where we are in the world. I mentioned that obviously. And as you were speaking, the idea struck me, are the narratives we're creating at the moment even more out there and wacky because we find ourselves living in a completely out there and wacky situation, that we've completely departed from all our sort of norms that we normally live in. So the narrative gets wackier as well.
Well, yes, that's right. The narratives, as I say, have to try to make sense of the incomprehensible, or the rise of the Nazis followed on the extremes of the financial catastrophe and the terrible outcomes of the Versailles, the loss of the war and the Versailles settlement. So odd and unusual conditions call for unusual and extreme narratives. We must always create a narrative that explains things. That's the theme throughout the book, that we are the language animal. We really depend on creating a narrative that is complete and explaining the situation.
So we fill the gaps with whatever fits our model that we build for ourselves, rather than necessarily what's
yes, and whether it's to our ultimate advantage or not. Anyway,
we find ourselves in, like I say, this really strange time, but also a time of unprecedented decision making. We're asked to elect leaders to the ultimate office or make decisions as a population that will affect our nations for generations. Yet there are concerns, quite valid ones, over the role of mass media in this, fake news, propaganda and disinformation at every turn. Do you think this is an attempt to deliberately mislead us and subvert us, or do you see it as a counter-narrative that we're trying to make sense of the position we find ourselves in and go from there, or is it actually more malicious?
Yes, I mean, at the moment, of course, we're in the throes of the American election, and that already seems to have thrown up some unexpected results. But one of the more interesting aspects of this has been the role of conspiracy theories. And it may be, since it's a very, very tight election, that these conspiracy theories that have been held, it must be said, more by the Republican side than the Democrat, may tip the balance. So it's quite interesting from a detached historical perspective. But for those who haven't heard of it, they're one of the primary conspiracy theories that have contributed to the American election is the so-called QAnon theory, which is widely believed in. And it claims that Donald Trump is fighting a secret war against an entrenched group of Satanist pedophiles engaged in child trafficking. This has got a certain notoriety, but needless to say, there's no evidence whatsoever to back this theory, but it is believed by many, and apparently has been responsible for an astonishing 44 million comments on Facebook. So it's certainly a factor in the election. The QAnon movement was openly supported by a number of Republican candidates, this ludicrous story, and it's never been repudiated by Trump. And the the Republicans aren't alone, though, in spreading these rumours. The Democrats weren't above using those tactics, and they've suggested that or some Democrats have suggested that the recent Trump COVID diagnosis was a completely put-up job. But this is America. American politics have always been a pretty rough area. Always.
Yeah.
But as to your original question, are these narratives part of an attempt to deliberately mislead? Well, as I've said, there will always be those unscrupulous enough to take advantage of credulous citizens for their own ends. But one intriguing aspect of the QAnon conspiracy theory, amongst others, is its origin. It's been suggested that the Russian interference may have had a part in it in its inception, and this can't be discounted. But also that it might have begun as a mere prank. Some prankster might have put it up, but either way, it clearly acquired a momentum all of its own. And this is what happens with stories. Stories get a life of their own. And there are plenty of examples of this, the self-reinforcing rumors in the history of social disquiet, and stories and rumors can spread like an infection in troubled times or disturbed, uncertain times like these. Probably those engaged in a post-election post-mortem will establish whether this puerile fantasy did in fact have any effect on the outcome of the election. We can't discount the notion that it would have produced a counter response. But it's clear that social media's capacity to supply endless, simplistic explanations to complex problems is a distinct and troubling new factor in public discourse. It's something that will feature, no doubt, in the future. And the only real antidote to this will be more energetic fact-checking resources. But of course, people that are prejudiced in the first place tend not to want their prejudices fact-checked. But
I suppose this is the ultimate way that any kind of, well, call it what it is, propaganda works, is that it only works in isolation if it's not challenged. You have to buy into it hook, line and sinker, don't you?
Well, that's right. It's there to do a job at a particular time and place. And if years later it's exposed, no matter, it's done its job.
Yeah, indeed. I remember my grandmother had this saying that a lie has no legs. If you tell a lie, you're going to have to tell another one to substantiate it, but you can't just let it stand because it very soon falls under. There's nothing to hold it up. And I do wonder if the state that we're in now with, certainly in the US election with rumors and these stories, if almost like a virus, they've spread and mutated into something bigger than they started off as, through being fed with people that want to buy into them and will sort of substantiate that rumor with even more outrageous suggestions.
Well, that's right. It's called an echo chamber effect, isn't it? With social media.
And with social media, it's getting worse. I mean, even I've noticed this, that it's in the interest of the social media companies to keep you on the hook, as it were, keep you interacting with their site, seeing ads and using their service even more and more. So they will, in some cases, almost show you what you want to see, then you'll keep seeing it.
And Trump will tell you what you want to hear. And one of the frightening aspects at the moment is Trump. He won't give up his Twitter. So if the results are problematic or very, very tight, he will use that as a very powerful weapon to.
Indeed. I mean, if propaganda tells you what you want to believe, certainly some of these characters, and Boris Johnson's no different in that sense, tell you what you want to hear. Whether it's we're going to build a wall or we're going to get Brexit done or whatever. they're little sound bites that really stir people up and inspire people.
And the people that use them are very expert now. Shall I read a bit from the book?
Please do, please.
That deals with this. Propaganda, the term propaganda originated with as a Catholic attempt to counter Protestant influence in way back in the early 17th century. And then, as we know, it was used by totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, from the 30s onwards. Which gave it a bad name. Nevertheless, its value was realized by the politicians and commentators of the successful democracies, particularly in the USA. And propaganda, the notion of propaganda was transformed into perception management in both the political and commercial spheres. After World War I, research into mass communications and how it could be used to influence behavioral change was greatly increased. Politicians wanted to know how they could best shape public opinion, and advertisers, as ever, simply wanted to sell products. Purveyors of the news wanted to reach ever more citizens, and all needed to know how to present information or persuade in the most effective ways. As a result, a whole new industry of persuasion came into being, which has developed a range of manipulative skills that now penetrate into every aspect of contemporary life. But this has to be put into context. In purely evolutionary terms, cheating may often be cheaper than telling the truth. And for this reason, it is a strategy that is widely adopted in nature. According to the primatologist Franz de Waal, bluffing, conning, and other deceptive forms of behavior are fairly common among chimpanzees, our closest cousins. But interestingly, they also exhibit proto-moral attitudes of fairness and empathy. They're complex beings like we are. In human society, cheating and conning one's fellows is regarded as distinctly immoral, but it is nevertheless widespread. And the possibilities to do so are greatly extended by our use of language. Chimpanzees can't fool each other with words, but we can. Our higher intelligence enables us to manipulate and outwit others in more complex ways. And in purely evolutionary terms, this instinct clearly has survival value for us, just as it does in ape societies. In the human sphere, whether it is done for material gain, sexual advantage, or simply putting one over for its own sake, fooling others in this way usually involves telling a story. And in the case of dedicated con artists and hoaxers, these stories can be extremely elaborate.
That is true.
Okay, so
I come from a background, an industry where confirmation bias has been regularly the cause of accidents, where anything that happens confirms the deeply held view of the person experiencing it, even if it's completely diametrically opposite to what's actually occurring. And, you know, lives semi-regularly get lost because of this human quality. Do you think at the moment we're constructing stories and narratives to confirm our own biases and reinforce our views rather than actually objectively seeing the world around us?
Yes, that is the case, of course. I've got a whole chapter of this in the book, chapter 10, where I deal with the human genius for rationalizing and justifying all our actions and beliefs. This actually ties in with an earlier topic dealt with in the book, namely the habit of confabulation, the tendency to weave our beliefs and ongoing outside events into a consistent narrative. Whether we are fully possessed of our mental faculties, that's where, as to say, whether we're sane, whether we consider ourselves sane or not, or whether even if we are completely compos mentis, our accounts, we absolutely have to construct a plausible narrative, plausible to ourselves, that is. And culturally, we also have to create a plausible cultural narrative. So yes, we're all experts at assembling and colluding with stories and narratives that confirm our own biases and our own views of the world. That's inevitable. We are hardwired storytellers. I've got a quote here from Michael Foley, the Irish writer, who says that the talent for self-justification is surely the finest flower of human evolution, the greatest achievement of the human brain. When it comes to justifying actions, every human being acquires the intelligence of an Einstein, the imagination of a Shakespeare, and the subtlety of a Jesuit.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And I know that we talked about some of the afflictions of social media earlier, certainly letting rumours spread. But regarding the internet itself, I mean, I remember when the internet really became a mass market vehicle in the mid-90s. And back then it was a world very much of other internet users were unusual and different to you. So I remember going to chat rooms in the mid to late 90s, and you'd see all these different points of view, and it was very much this feeling of this bubble that you're in, where, you know, wizards stayed up late, where ideas got shared and anything was possible. But what we've seen in the last few years is very much the introduction of the echo chamber, that people are clustering into these little groups of people that reinforce their own ideas. And over that time, the internet's crept into absolutely every corner of human life. The fact that we're doing this interview right now on Zoom rather than meeting up in person, I know that coronavirus has accelerated this, but demonstrates this quite well, that the internet seems to be almost omnipresent at the moment. And it does expose us to countless points of view. It does provide us with an echo chamber to hear other voices like ours. On the whole, would you say it's harmful, helpful, or is it a case of that sort of depends and it varies how you use it?
Yes, well, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the Wild West aspects of the internet. Overall, its role has been positive. I think that's unquestionable. Knowledge of every kind has become available on a worldwide basis, and ideas can be exchanged at unprecedented speeds across continents. Social media is connecting people as never before. But the ideas that you spoke of many of the original pioneers, the ideas and the expectations actually of the developers of the internet, who hoped it would promote greater understanding and cross-cultural sympathies, have been outflanked by human nature. Human nature has taken over the internet, of course. It's not just nerds these days. As with so many of the utopian visionaries of the past, their brave new internet world was soon overtaken by many of the familiar and less endearing aspects of human behavior. Criminality, of course, aggression, hatreds even, and greed and deceit, etc., etc. We're all familiar with these aspects.
That's true.
But in the long run, as with the Wild West, it will have to be tamed. The internet will have to be tamed. This situation and the possibilities it holds for deviant behavior is inimical to any principled civilized life, and it'll have to be resolved, because ultimately the great majority of us want to live safe, untroubled lives. And it's pretty clear, though, that the social media companies themselves and or many others concerned with the internet are unwilling to police themselves.
That's true.
National governments are the only forces that I can see that will eventually be in a position to compel better compliance with their own laws, their own natural laws, and natural justice and decency. This will require fairly tough and globally based antitrust measures. There is a precedent for this in the US in the early part of the 20th century, where the excessive powers of the corporate cartels were getting completely out of hand, and they were curbed by the antitrust laws, which were quite draconian. They did the job there, and where they didn't go far enough, in my view, because the corporations have still got an enormous influence beyond their justification.
Looking at this from the person using the internet's perspective rather than the actual companies, obviously some of the strengths of the internet are still very much there, the right to freedom of speech, to share ideas, to do all these things. But given our hardwired tendencies to engage in behavior that might not be exactly true, for want of a better word, there's been a lot of mentioning recently of effectively policing fake news and rumours and similar on social media. And you mentioned government oversight there. Is this something that's in the interest of the people experiencing life as a human being, or is it potentially dangerous with the involvement of governments in policing what's said? How do you sort of square the circle between freedom of speech and freedom of people to read stuff that isn't made up?
Well, this is all part of the uncertainty of the present time. I think the uncertainties that have led Trump's popularity is because in a way he represents something they can understand. It's interesting. I've got a quote here from Marshall McLuhan that says, and this was made way back in the 60s, and he was the visionary that saw a lot of what is happening now. But he says, we become what we behold. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. Well, the tools of the 20th century have certainly shaped America. I mean, Hollywood and the media, the American media, have certainly shaped American society. And it's not a coincidence that people like Ronald Reagan and Schwarzenegger and Trump were all media celebrities in one way or another. They represent something that Americans can understand or believe they understand.
I suppose that's very true, and actually seeing these people even in fictitious settings like a film or and we'd hardly call The Apprentice a factual-based program. It's entertainment, but seeing entertainers.
But it strikes a narrative. It's a narrative that people can comprehend as a relatively simple one. The simple dramas of Hollywood are something that Americans have brought up. They invented.
And I suppose it applies the story as well to these people in office, because people are used to seeing these characters acting, and that's what it is, in a way that's comforting and nice to them. You know, well, he's the strong man from The Apprentice, or he's the action hero, or these characters are sort of the hero from the film that they're watching, and because they're seeing them in the media in their role as an entertainer, they're familiar to people and understandable. So when someone like that shows up to run for high office, suddenly,
the particular ex-actors and ex-media people that do this have obviously got something else. They're very manipulative, and in Trump's case, narcissistic personalities, and they're quite ruthless in exploiting these the weaknesses of the susceptibilities. But I've got something on this. Shall I read it from the book?
David, please do.
It's this is to do with conspiracy theories. Because conspiracy theories really predate the internet, but they've made a complete transition to it. The obscure publications of pamphlets of that conspiracy theories used to thrive on have been completely taken over by the internet as the medium of choice.
Yeah.
Social media websites and emails between them have offered unprecedented means of disseminating stories and ideas to a vast audience, and ensure that their contents are distributed around the world in hours or minutes rather than months or years. The power of the internet to transform society has already been amply demonstrated, but it seems that the full ramifications of a completely connected world have yet to be fully worked through. And we've spoken of ways that this can be done and will be done. Amongst other effects, though, it has meant that wild rumours and conspiracy theories and the like are now far more prevalent than in the past. Fortunately, there is also a counterbalance in the form of skeptical debunking sites such as Snopes.com and discussion groups like Usenet and other fact-checking sites. I can see a big future for those.
I think we're going to need them as a sort of if not moral, factual compass. And I know that Facebook recently has started actually putting little tags above certain posts, like, you know.
Oh, yes, just very recently, yes. That is interesting. So this is a response to the Wild West aspect. You know, we don't want to live in a Wild West. It's great to see on the screen, but we don't want to live in a world where people can rip us off, take all our savings, all the rest of it.
Well, I suppose at least having a little button over a Facebook post saying, get the facts with an independent audit of that statement really is a lot better than just saying you can't say it. Because I mean, if I and a few others went down to the pub and had a discussion, if one of us said something outlandish, well, it might get some laughs, but people would say, well, actually, hang on, that's not right, David, because actually this is the case. And it sort of self-moderates by...
Yes, self-moderation is always preferable.
But the echo chamber doesn't self-moderate, it amplifies. No content.
It amplifies in an unprecedented way, and it's quite frightening, actually.
I suppose it's
the QAnon phenomena is an example of that. It's extraordinary, and the interesting thing is that it seems to have seems to have developed a life of its own, where it gathered like a sort of a tornado. It seems to be gathering up the energy, the negative energy from wherever it touches, and so the outcome of this election, the current US presidential election, will be very interesting to see
completely
whether it marks a change in attitudes, and the post-mortem will be interesting too, to see. I mean, it's fairly, I think it's fairly clear that Trump was elected with the help of with foreign interference. All this he's obviously played that down. But the other thing is that, and I'm again reading from the book, so this is a slight change in key, but ironically, the shift in public consciousness brought about by the emergence of the internet is historically associated with genuine conspiratorial threats. The appalling 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers will always act as a convenient marker of the new realities of globalism and technology, just as the Islamist jihadist terror movement, ISIS, has repeatedly demonstrated the shocking efficiency of the internet's persuasive powers. The globally interconnected nature of the internet means that genuine news is transmitted more rapidly than in the pre-cyber past, but the same is true of rumor, conspiracy theories, and extreme political and religious propaganda. Social networks in particular spread information, often of dubious veracity, extremely efficiently, which, among other things, has meant that conspiracy theorists with different agendas are brought into contact and cross-fertilize each other in unlikely ways. Unfortunately, the sharing of unmediated opinion and hateful and insightful views can bolster these extreme outlooks. This is a process that is facilitated by the anonymity offered by this medium.
That's true.
So,
I think it's no coincidence, and certainly now living in the time of a virus, we can understand how things spread and reproduce a lot better than we could 6 months ago.
yes.
It's no coincidence that the term, which I think is now being deprecated by current events for something spreading quickly on the internet, was it went viral. And I think that pretty much describes where we're up to.
Yes, yes. So you've got another question for me?
I do. Would you say that our ability to tell stories and construct narratives is our greatest strength or our greatest weakness? Because obviously it's given birth to literature, the arts, poetry, music, some amazing narrative derived things, but at the same time it's given rise to fake news, propaganda, some pretty heavy stuff.
Right. Well, because we are such highly social animals, and because our worlds are primarily defined by the particular language we use, we essentially live our lives in extended narratives. There's a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre that says, "A man is always a teller of tales. He lives surrounded by his stories. He sees everything that happens to him through them, and he tries to live his life as if he were recounting it." So, but in our day-to-day existence, it's hard to see this. It's hard to be to take this in quite the pat way that Sartre puts it. But in the book, I've referred to the proverb, if you want to know about water, it's no good asking a fish. So it's no good asking human beings or telling human beings that they live out their stories, because they're not really aware of it. We are immersed in our stories. Language has bestowed our species with almost magical capabilities. We're set apart from all other animals by virtue of this skill, but there is a price for it, and it's a commensurate price. Our dependence on language makes us vulnerable to persuasion, manipulation, and cheating of many, many kinds. But as I said earlier, the use of underhand methods in the persuasion of deceit, we shouldn't think we're ever going to do away with this. Sorry, there's a telephone in the back. It will be answered.
That's absolutely fine. Jumping off from that and going back over something in a way, and that's that the use of language. I'm going to invoke Orwell here, as it was only a matter of time to do. There's been a growing trend, certainly in business and advertising communities, you mentioned earlier, big businesses, government even, to use some pretty underhand methods to secure sales and garner support, sell products, influence people, whatever. In the wider world, psychological nudges are frequently deployed. but none more so than the use of words. And the fact that we're talking about fake news is a good example here. Does how we use language and how language changes affect how we use our narratives and place ourselves in reality or disreality? An example of this, fake news, it's a nonsensical term in a way, because news is clearly true and fake news is clearly untrue. We call fake news either propaganda or what it is, which is lies. It's not fake news at all, it's a lie. Deliberately or accidentally spread, but it's a lie. Are we in danger of inventing an Orwellian newspeak where we actually give credence to ridiculous concepts by making them credulous? So fake news, well, it implies it's news, right? Because even though it's fake, it's still news. And Donald Trump actually said that.
Well, famously, Trump adopted him. He told that people were asking him reasonable questions about real events. He accused them of peddling fake news, so he turned it around.
And
he's a very skillful manipulator.
The other favourite that his mouthpiece spouted was when confronted with facts, she said, "I've got some alternative facts for you." Well, there isn't such thing as alternative facts. It's a lie. It's either true or it's not.
Well, it's not a recent development.
Okay.
In fact, as long as there have been a news media, there have been dubious fake news.
Okay.
And I'll read from the book here, because I do deal with it in chapter 6, which is called Persuasive Narratives.
Mm-hmm.
I say that there's no distinct line of demarcation between the straightforward dissemination of information and the use of persuasion as to the value of that information. Neither is there a clear distinction between persuasion, induction, and outright deception. All of these activities lie on a sliding scale, with the simple conveyancing of information at one end and criminal deceit at the other. But humans are not unique in this regard, as I said earlier. The whole spectrum of informing, persuading, and deceiving is ubiquitous in nature, where it is an established part of the evolutionary survival toolkit. Sexual displays, camouflage, aggressive postures all convey information and are sometimes deceptive. As I said earlier, our primate cousins, the chimpanzees, are notorious persuaders and deceivers, and have been credited with high levels of Machiavellian intelligence. And since we are so closely related, it's perhaps not so surprising that we humans exercise these skills from time to time. In fact, it could be said that they're found to a greater or smaller degree in most human transactions. That is to say, the exchanges of ideas, opinions, commodities are rarely made without some, at least minimal, attempt to influence the recipient. If this sounds like a depressingly cynical view of human interaction, then consider how difficult it seems to be for any of us to be impartial or objective when passing on information, how easily enthusiasm slips into exaggeration, how natural it is to want to impress others with our knowledge, and how misgivings so easily become a disparagement. We are all persuaders by nature. Opinion, in fact, is the coinage of the social economy.
Very, very wise words to think on there, David.
Thank you.
Have you got any other readings to share with us, or should I move on? So I think we discussed the other day about another reading. If you don't, if that was it, don't worry, I'll move on.
Well, there's something I prepared here. How do we, in response to your question, how are we to distill our stories into objective history? How are we to arrive at objective truth. But there's a tricky one. We can see with hindsight better.
Okay.
To assemble an objective account of complex events of the sort we're going through now is bound to take time. And even then, we can never be entirely free of prejudices. Napoleon famously declared that history is the version of past events that people have decided to agree on. And it's hard to disagree with that. But of course, we do need a sense of history, or at least a sustaining mythology. The philosopher Mary Midgley said that we are accustomed to think of myths as the opposite of science, but they are in fact a central part of it. So we need our myths, our stories, they're in fact central to our lives. They are imaginative patterns and networks of powerful symbols that suggest particular ways of interpreting the word. So,
yeah, I mean, it puts me in mind of an old statement that I heard when I was at university, which is that the plural of experience is not data. But then if you take the plural of experience, it can become data if you sift it. And I suppose that's very much how we've got to behave with our history, isn't it?
yes.
We've got to examine and tease out the threads of it to understand it. Lastly, David, very important question, really, and I suppose none of us have got forward-looking glasses here, but where do we go from here in using our stories wisely, in being prudent with what we believe, but still using our ability to construct narratives and stories as the biggest strength that we have? I mean, it's a bit of an open-ended question, isn't it?
Well, it would be very nice if we were wise, but humans are complex creatures. We're not always wise. We don't know when we're not being wise. I'll read from the postscript here. I think it is appropriate.
Okay.
None of us live or could ever live in atomistic isolation. Our individualized free-willing selves are, ironically, only realizable within a cultural context. We've all been socialized into a particular cultural-based narrative, and although we're scarcely ever aware of the fact, this is the matrix of our reality. There is more to all of us, of course, than the mere reenactment of broad cultural assumptions. These deep narratives are infinitely moderated by layers of subcultural narratives, and by local, familial, and personal influences, and by individual interpretations of all of the above. As a result, and despite our being thoroughly culture-bound, we each have our own mythology, our own outlook that determines the way we think, feel, and interact with the greater world. This way of living and relating to others of our own kind is uniquely human. It's almost entirely facilitated by our aptitude for language and its supporting narratives. Mm-hmm. So, yes, we need the stories that we tell each other and believe in and live by can be improved. They can be made healthier. I think that's the answer. Mm-hmm. Not that we need to be ideological about this,
sure.
But to, as all the religions say, to be better, more considerate and more rational human beings. I mean, it's completely banal answer. It's the only answer to those sort of questions, really, as far as I can see. We've got to be better people and write better stories, tell better stories about each other, and expose lies, of course.
That's brilliant. David, have you any closing comments to share?
Well, that will do for me, I think.
That will do. Okay. David, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. I really enjoyed Story Animal when we first got the manuscript. It's a very rich book. There's a lot in there. I'd say it's a manual for surviving our current times, with the soup of propaganda, lies, truths, half-truths, rumours, stories that are floating around us every day. I think it's a manual to make sense of what we're seeing and to actually use to get a bit of a depth on what we're exposed to as a framework to understand.
I hope it helps things along.
So do I. It's a very good book, and for anyone that wants to purchase this book, which we highly recommend, it's available now from us, Herbury Books. The title is The Story Animal: Reflections on the Narrative and its Extraordinary Power to Inform, Persuade and Enchant. All three of those actions being quite important in our life day-to-day as humans. It's available from us, like I say, Herbury Books. It's available from Amazon. It's available from Waterstones and WH Smith. You might have to ask them for it by name, but it's available. And like I say, it's a manual for our times, and we very, very, very much hope that it brings a little context, a little comfort, and a little understanding to making sense of the world that we live in at the moment. David, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.